Oh no. I am missing some very important pieces of aesthetic. Let's go fix this. Recording. Good, good. Yes. I don't wear this cuff that much these days. I used to wear this all the time in high school, but when you're rocking the Cerberus shirt, you gotta wear a collar, man. That's just, I'm repping my favorite bisexual disaster Prince today, and that requires some additional jewelry. So anyway, hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. I did this video last year, it was my first time doing it, and some people really liked it, and I had fun talking about it. So we're gonna do it again. This is my wrap up on 2020 in terms of statistics, as well as a little bit about my 2021 goals. So if you have been following along, shall we say, on my channel this year, you would know that I have not read that much this year due to the everything that's been happening. So to give you guys a little bit of perspective, in 2018, I read a total of 70 books. In 2019, I read a total of 72 books. And then in 2020, I read 36. So 2020 was a shit show. But we all know that. While I didn't read that many books this year, I actually don't ever really have a goal of how many books I want to read in a year. I always sort of vaguely shoot for 50, but it's not a hard and set goal. So the fact that I only read 36 is not so much me failing at a goal so much as just indicative of how my year went. So getting into my actual goals, my primary goal and the reason that I keep a reading spreadsheet, or the reason I started keeping one in the first place, is to track the author ethnicity of the books that I'm reading. And my goal is to read less than 50% white authors. That's been my goal for the last couple of years. Last year I managed it just barely. This year I just barely didn't manage it in that I read exactly 50% as white authors, which is kind of the bare minimum of that goal. That's how it goes. Obviously I want to improve this next year, but I read exactly half, 50% white authors. I read exactly a third black authors. And then I read about 14% Asian and Asian American authors. I do combine those. And then 3%, aka one book, was by a native author. That one will come up again later. I didn't like it. Okay, so my next goal for this year in particular was to try to get my physical TBR down. So I needed to read more books on my physical TBR, and I said that I wanted about a third to be books from my physical TBR. I did manage that just about. It was about a third physical books. It was then also about a third ebooks, a little bit higher, like 36%. And so audiobooks actually took a big hit because in 2019, I had 16% physical books, 42% ebooks, and 40% audiobooks. And audiobooks this year is down to 28% because I stopped commuting. So I stopped listening to audiobooks in my car. So that did actually, you know, open up some time for physical book reading. But I would still like that to be higher because I still think I bought more books this year than I read physical books this year, so that needs to change. Yes, I did also track the source of how I got my books. This one wasn't really a goal, except that I wanted to focus on books that I had on my physical TBR for a while. So 20% of the books that I read were what I considered physical old, as in I bought them before 2020, but then 14% were physical new, as in I bought them in 2020. 40% came from the library. Thank you very much, my local public library, for all of the romance books that I borrowed this year. And then 11% were borrowed from friends, most of them before COVID, that I have had sitting around for a while. So honestly, the borrowed ones I'm pretty okay with because those are also physical books on my TBR that I need to finish and then give back. So another one of my goals was to have queer representation in my books. Not a super hard and fast goal. I was aiming for like 15 to 20%. And then I read a bunch of gay romance novels. So when I actually ended up reading 17 out of 36 books were gay in some way, which was a grand total of 47%. So almost half of the books that I read this year were gay. And also this is gay as in a main character or very highly featured secondary character is explicitly on the page queer. And that, you know, being an actual part of the story rather than just like an offhand mention, right? I read some great gay books, and there were some that were a little bit more serious. Like I read The Deep, I read Freshwater, that weren't just like fluffy gay romance novels, but they were queer and really great. Did I read The Deep this year or in 2020? It's 2021 now, remember that? Did I read The Deep in 2020? God, I did. That feels like it happened 12 years ago. Well, I read it in February, so that essentially was 12 years ago. That was in the before times. Anyway, yeah, I kind of stopped being able to focus on serious books once COVID hit, with a couple exceptions, but anyway, some great gay romance novels. I've talked about them a few times. KJ Charles was super great discovery for me this year, as well as I discovered gay Chinese web novels, which I talked about in my top 5 of the year, so go check those out if you want. Okay, another one of my categories and goals that I had, you know, a vague idea of what I wanted to be reading was for disability representation. And again, I wanted it to be around that like 20%-ish kind of range. And I did pretty well on this one, so 9 out of the 36 books that I read featured characters that had some kind of disability. There were some that had more mental disabilities, like the guy in Take a Hint, Danny Brown, he has like a diagnosed anxiety disorder. And then there are people with physical disabilities, like in Kingdom of the Gods. I talked about it in my top 5. The main character is blind, who's telling the story. And there were the Queen's Thief series. I won't get into that one, but if you've read it, if you know, you know. So yeah, a full 25% of the books that I read had some kind of disability representation. I do want to keep that number up going into 2021, and we'll see how it goes. So one thing that I did start tracking this year that was new was I started tracking the original language that it had been written in, which I started doing because in the beginning of the year I was reading some manga and I was reading the Witcher books. And you know, manga is obviously originally in Japanese and the Witcher books were originally in Polish, and so I just thought, oh, this will be just kind of interesting to track, you know, the original language. I ended up dropping the Witcher series after about 4 titles, I think. I think I read both short story collections and then the first 2 of the novels. And by the end of the second novel, I was just like not feeling it anymore. And I didn't end up reading a ton of manga this year. I read a few here and there, but anyway, 28 of the books that I read were originally in English, which, you know, I expected. It's about 3/4 of them. And then Polish, I had 4. Japanese, I had 3. And then Sleeper Hit, I had a book in Chinese because, again, I discovered gay Chinese web novels this year and they're delightful. Undecided if I'm gonna keep tracking language going into next year. It kind of depends on if I feel like I'm reading more translated works than I normally do, because I don't tend to read a ton of translated works. But yeah, if you guys are interested in that, let me know. So in terms of genre this year, last year I had a bunch of different kinds of genres. I had you know, fantasy, romance, classics, science fiction, mystery, poetry, nonfiction, comics. This year, I had 5 categories and really only 2 that were the main ones. So I read 47% fantasy, down a tiny bit from 50% fantasy last year, but honestly, about the same. Last year, however, I read about 7% romance novels, and this year that was a whole 36% romance novels. So more than a third of my reading this year was romance novels, which I'm okay with, but is a thing. I read a little bit more nonfiction this year than I did last year, which was partly for some school assignments, partly for reading stuff about Black Lives Matter, and then also there was a memoir in there, which was Wishful Drinking by Carrie Fisher. May she rest in peace. And then I also read some horror this year, which I didn't do last year. And then I also read one that I just labeled as fiction, but it's a sports manga. It was the first volume of Haikyuu. I just didn't know what else to call it, so I called it fiction, but it's a shonen sports manga. So yeah, a lot less diversity of genre this year, because that is what my brain could handle, was fantasy and romance novels. And if you could combine those, like I did read some fantasy romance novels, or just some queer fantasy, just best of both worlds, you know what I'm saying? Okay, so I guess the last category that we're gonna be talking about are my ratings. And because I had such a short list of books this year and such a short attention span, I have no idea how many books I started and didn't finish this year. I want to do that DNF tag that everyone on BookTube was doing a little bit ago, because I have been DNFing like crazy this year, but that meant that I don't really have a lot of books that I didn't like. So because of that, I didn't have any 1-star ratings this year, because I just either didn't even get around to starting or immediately put down any book that would have been a 1-star for me. I only had 2 books that were 2-star ratings. Both of them were horror. It was Crota by Al Going Back. This was the book by a native author. This book is older than I thought it was. I thought it had been published much more recently, and what I discovered while I was reading it was that it had been published in like the 80s, and there were some things in it that didn't age well, both in terms of like what we find scary and also just like the way that we talk about people. Don't want to say too much more about that. Anyway, the other one was Lullaby by Jonathan Mayberry. This was a short story that I read for Spookathon that I then completely forgot to talk about for the rest of Spookathon because it was not good. It's like 2.5 hours on audiobook. It had some spooky beginnings, but by the end, the characters are acting like such fucking idiots that I lost all sympathy for them, and I lost all ability to get invested in the story, which meant that I didn't care by the like scary ending. So yeah, not good. And then I had a good selection of 3 and 3.5 star books. I had 12 of them. So the 3 and 3.5 star ratings are kind of a mix. Some of the nonfiction is in there, some of the romance novels are in there. The 4 stars also, a lot of the romance novels ended up being in the 4-star range, as well as quite a few of the fantasy that I read this year. And then I had 7 5-star reads this year, which is great compared to last year, because I did have 8 5-star reads, but percentage-wise, when I read 70-something books, that's a lot lower percentage than when I've only read 36. So 4 of those were rereads. The first 2 of the N.K. Jemisin 100,000 Kingdoms series, and Queen of Atolia and King of Atolia from the Queen's Thief series, which are just down here, I think. Yeah. I had to rearrange my bookshelves because I got some more box sets for Christmas / my birthday, which is coming up on Monday. So maybe I'll do a video on that. Maybe I'll do a books I got for Christmas and my birthday video after this. But anyway, I had to rearrange some stuff, so Queen of Atolia and King of Atolia. I read these essentially back to back the week that I finished my spring semester finals. I was just like, okay, I'm done with school, I have time, I have brain power, books. And I got through both of these in like 3 days. The rest of the series is really good, but these 2 books are so good. Oh my god. You could almost skip book 1, The Thief, and just read... Drink some water. I almost feel like you could skip the first book entirely. You shouldn't, because it's fun and it has a great twist at the end. But you could almost skip that book entirely and just read these 2 books. And you would still have gotten why I'm obsessed with this series, even if you read nothing else. You should read the rest because they're all really good, but they do have like different tones to them because they also have different point of view characters. They take place in different parts of the world. They're all interconnected and they are linear, but each one has like its own arc. So I'm not over these. Again, I've read them before and then I read them again this year and died all over again. I didn't talk about these in my top 5 of the year. These were my like honorable mentions that I forgot that I do. But I didn't put them in because they were rereads, and I already had Kingdom of the Gods on there, and that's also a reread, and I've talked about this series possibly too many times. I feel like you guys are gonna get sick of me talking about these. So that's, yeah, that's where we are. So then the last of the 5-star reads that were the new books that I read this year that were 5 stars were in my top 5. The ones that I said if I had to pick a top 2. So it was Gideon the Ninth / Harrow the Ninth. I gave both of those 5 stars. And then also Heavenly Official's Blessing, the gay Chinese web novel, because it was perfect to me. Yeah, I don't rate many books 5 stars, if you couldn't tell. And the ones that I do rate 5 stars, it's not necessarily that I think that they're perfect objectively to everyone, but to quote that creepy guy from Love Actually, to me, they are perfect. All right, guys, so that is going to be my 2020 stats. Not a ton to talk about this year because there just weren't that many books to talk about this year. Slash my 2021 goals, pretty much similar to 2020 before 2020 became a dumpster fire. And I want to hear from you guys. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I've talked about, or if you had reading goals, how did they go? I tend to keep my reading goals very achievable, so even when I have a shit show year like 2020, I can still mostly manage to achieve them. In fact, I honestly kind of got a boost from being at home. It was a lot easier to read physical books because I didn't have to be carrying them around everywhere. But then I was hampered by the fact that I couldn't read anything. So let me know how you guys did on your reading goals, if you had them, if you completely gave them up, you know, check in with me. Let me know how you're doing. But at any rate, I will see you all very soon with another video. Thanks for watching. Bye!